For a long time, the rule was that you would buy a OK CPU and you would spend the rest of the money on the best GPU you could buy. Personally, I would use a different rule where I would buy a OK CPU and maybe spend between 200 to 300 Canadian to get a GPU, and every couple of years just upgrade it. Of course, there was some legendary CPU I used during that time, like the Q6600, the i7 2770K, and for AMD more recently, the Ryzen 2600, 3600, and 5600X were all good CPU I ended up buying and give the previous one to a family member. And I feel things changed lately with GPU pricing post-pandemic and the launch with the great X3D processor, which are probably the best processor you can get for gaming. Another rule, or at least some trend that people follow, seems to get a higher end CPU that you would normally get, and then just try to get the GPU you can afford, or maybe look at the used market. I have a 7800 X3D that I use with the Be Quiet build when I test their, but I'm still using my RTX 3070 in it. Still waiting for someone sending me a better GPU. I'm kind of half kidding there, but I'm also mostly a console gamer. So my 3070 at 4040p is still okay for me, though I'm still annoyed that it's only at 8 gig of VRAM. But it made me think, what would happen if I use this great CPU with modern hardware and just throw at it terrible GPU? First contender, the RX 6400, which was never a great buy. And like the fact that this was missing feature like video encoding and decoding at the hardware level, and for the price the card was, it was not really something that was recommended in a lot of reviews. A friend had it in a box, so when I mentioned this idea of video, it was like, oh, I have a perfect GPU for you. And then I found that masterpiece, the ATI W2100. Now, it's a 11-year-old GPU, and it's an office GPU, so I expect terrible graphic performance, and we're just gonna do it for fun. I'll test them at 1080p. I don't really feel that there's a point, especially if you look at the box, it said like 1080p graphic on the RX 6400. So I don't really feel that trying to go to 1440p or even 4K make really much sense. Yeah, the card would struggle, but it was never a good use case.
Okay, so the first step is to do a quick unboxing of the RX 6400. It says it's a 1080p card with 4 gig of VRAM and support PCI Express 4.0. It also supports Fidelity FX, DirectX 12, and FreeSync. Now we can see here at the back that we have a HDMI port and a display port. Also, it was a low profile bracket, and I'm not gonna tell how long it took me to realize that I need a regular bracket that was in the box and didn't realize it. Even if it's a ATX bracket include on the box. We can also see here how tiny is the card, especially against modern GPU like the RTX 3070. I did capture some gameplay video here while playing Destiny 2, just to see how it would be like when trying to play the game. Then I start playing Forza Horizon in the open world at 1080p with low settings, and honestly the game was playing super good. I was impressed. I didn't expect that like I would feel the performance smooth. Now I understand that there was no car around and I was just messing around in the open world, but still I was impressed. Then I tried Cyberpunk 2077. Surprisingly, at 1080p low with Fidelity FX, it was playing around like 40 FPS. So I did other gameplay where I shoot around and things like that, and it seems fine. I think you could play at 1080p, but of course, then I decided to be an asshole and try ray tracing overdrive on an unsupported card. Of course, it was a slideshow. It was not exactly unexpected though. I was still surprised that it actually ran. No, Doom the Dark Age was not a good experience. And this is where I had to check the spec and realize that like I could not lower the VRAM usage lower that 8 gig, and they were asking for, I think, for a minimum configuration of 8 gig. So it's running, but it's being like super slow here. Not a good experience. Now let's talk about the spec. I'm using my 7800 X3D processor with X670 Gaming's ROG Strix motherboard. We have 32 gigs of DDR5 at 6000 megahertz and CL1330, that which is the sweet spot for Ryzen right now on AM5. Inline performance plus 1 terabyte NVMe PCI Express 4.0, and the graphic card will switch, but by default, my Asus Dual RTX 3070. So let's look at benchmark next. Divinity Original Sin 2 at 1080p medium setting. On my 3070, I would get an average of 346 FPS, while the RX 6400 would get to 114 FPS. And then I would get around like 9 FPS on the W2100. So it really didn't play the game well. Also put the low percent, the 1% low on this graphic. I then switched to 80s. By default, I left the ultra wide 1440p resolution. It had like frame on the side, but it's basically like FPS locked on the frame rate. So I was around the 175 FPS that I have on my monitor at 174 with the 3070. Then it was at 120 average FPS using the RX 6400 and 37 like FPS on the W2100. So 80s was very playable on all the 3 graphic card. 3D Mark Still Nomad Light was next at Vulkan default setting. I had an average FPS of 26 on the RX 6400. It is the mobile benchmark. I tried then to run it on the W2100, but it would crash and say that my hardware is not supported. Destiny 2 was next, but it's not a benchmark because the anti-cheat don't let you run Afterburner and Riva Turner stats. So it's more like the lowest FPS that I would get while shooting in a single player mission. For the 3070, I got an average of, the lowest FPS that I would see in that range is the 270, while for the RX 6400, it would be around 75. So totally playable. But then I would get between 9 to 12 FPS on the W2100, so at 1080p medium. So I wouldn't say that it's playable at that resolution. Now for Doom the Dark Age at 1080p low with dynamic resolution, I would get an average FPS of 14 for the RX 6400 and 1% low at 12. Now for my RTX 3070, the gameplay was great. It was smooth. I was still using 1080p low, but for some reason the logging didn't work. And because of the requirement, I was not able to start the game with the W2100. Forza Horizon 5 was next at 1080p medium. I would get an average of 174 FPS, which is basically the 175 hertz rate of my OLED monitor. Then when I switched to the RX 6400, I would get an average of 120 FPS, and it would be super smooth, even if it looked kind of ugly. So I think the game is totally playable that way. I would get an average of 9 FPS on the W2100, so not really playable. I did try to lower the resolution to 1024 by 768, but I think then the FPS went around an average of 15, so I would still don't use that card for that. Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p medium with FX 2.1 was next. I got an average of 90 FPS on the RTX 3070, but it was me shooting everything around. I'm sure I could get an higher average FPS if I tried. But then on the RX 6400, I was surprised to see that I could play around 47 FPS and it was totally playable. No, I was getting a 2 FPS average with ray tracing overdrive at 1080p, but it was more for laughing at the graphic card that's really expecting that I would play at overdrive. Even with my 3070, I'm not even considering playing at that setting. So where does that leave us?
So what did I think of this useless test? First, if you watch the video until then, I'm really sorry that you lose all that time. And I hope at least that you were entertained. My first conclusion is that the 3070 is the best graphic card of the three. Yeah, that's not exactly a surprise, isn't it? But more seriously, I think that like even if the RX 6400 was never considered a great card, because of the X3D processor being so good, I think for some game it just seems to work fine and you have a good experience. Like 80s was great. The Divinity Original Sin also, the second game. And even Forza Horizon, yeah, I was at 1080p low and could look a little ugly, but it was totally fine playing it. And I'm sure after a couple of minutes you forget that you're playing a game like on this hardware. Now, the ATI 2100 was an horrible experience. It's not exactly surprising, and playing game like 80s was fine. And honestly, if you only have an office GPU and you have a good CPU, I mean, it's the only choice you have, so you should definitively try it. Maybe some esports game would work great, but I'm not really FPS kind of like player, so don't really test those. And honestly, if I was really testing and reviewing the GPU, I would find games that are 10-year-old or like that been released before or just after the GPU and compare them to them. I just decided to not do that there. I understand it's not super fair for the card, but because more modern game were working with the RX 6400, I was like, well, then we're gonna just test those games, and it's a more realistic choice. Now, if you need a CPU, also, I would probably look at a processor like with the APU like the Ryzen 8600G or 8700G, just because I feel that you get better performance this way. And I think on the higher end is the same CPU of the same GPU as my ROG Ally, which for 1080p gaming and under, it was totally fine when plugged on a PC. Of course, I would also look first at the used market and try to find a good graphic card there because entry level graphic card have never been really like a good value lately. Now, the only exception I would say, and it's not really an entry level graphic card, is that the ARC B580. When I tested it, I really loved the performance for the price, which is 369 Canadian at an MSRP. So I think it's a good option if you need to buy new. But it's also dependent on what card you have right now. Do you have one or not? And things like that. Thanks for watching.